back to the Upside Down People podcast, Steve. So glad to be having another conversation with you here today on opposite ends of Australia this time.
Yeah, last time I think we were at your place, and this time I'm in Sydney, and
Yeah,
you're still in Perth.
exactly. Yeah, I'm still in my place. You're in your new place. How has the big move gone? Because I think last time, I don't know if you're officially public with it yet, but you've moved across now, and you said you'd been there for a couple of weeks.
And it felt like a very long, slow, drawn-out process, and it was. But yeah, public with it now, I hope, because we're living here. Yeah, it felt like moving countries, not to the other side of the country, because Australia is so big, and there's a cultural difference. It just feels different. We're in the inner west of Sydney, and that probably feels a little bit like some of the inner city suburbs of Perth.
Okay.
It's obviously it's a vast city, Sydney. It just feels exponentially bigger.
Right. Yeah. So you said there's like some cultural differences between the two that you've already noticed. What are those?
Got to pick my way through this minefield, don't I? I think Sydney feels slightly brasher in some way. I think Perth work hard, play hard. Sydney has layers sort of history that show how the city has grown. So if I were to say Christianly, Perth feels a little bit more secular and Sydney feels a bit more pagan. But you can see the church history of the city in Sydney in a way that feels very different to Perth. Not saying Sydney's more, well, is it more religious? Perhaps it is, but it feels different. You can feel the history of Sydney in a different way to the history of Perth. Perth has a transience to it, I think, at some level.
Okay.
But Sydney has a settledness to it, I think. That's not just because Perth feels a bit more like a gleaming city, like an oil and gas and mining city. That's
Right.
And Sydney just feels a little bit different to that, I think.
Yeah, fascinating.
And the geography makes a big difference. So Sydney is lots of villages that have joined up into a city, but you kind of stay in your village lest you have to try and traverse the centre of town and get across 3 bridges to get somewhere else. Keep all your friends in your own area. That's what.
Yeah, Perth, we just have to worry about one bridge.
And here I just got across the Harbour Bridge successfully, and now have to navigate the roadworks just beyond the Anzac Bridge, and that's like, oh my goodness.
Yeah, crazy. I'm glad you settling in all right. A question I do have in terms of, so last time there's quite a few, the move was part of it, but changes going on in your life. What does life look like for you now that you've gone to Sydney or that you're settling down there?
Well, part of it was for family reasons to move because I was traveling a lot. A lot of my work is on the East Coast, in Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, up and down the East Coast. So it looks more settled, looks more like finding a church again. It's interesting moving in your mid to late 50s compared to moving younger. It feels scarier, riskier. You uproot more, I guess. When you're young, youth is wasted on the young, they say. And part of that is that let's just do this. When in your 50s, you go, let's just do this as the equivalent of, let's just climb that ladder and clean the least out of the gutter. You could fall. But it's still fun, but it's a lot riskier. And it's aging parents back in Perth. It's a daughter who doesn't come with you. All those mini losses that you forget about, I think, that suddenly hit you. I like technology. Good old WhatsApp. You can keep the touch a little bit easier. When parents leave for Australia, it felt like moving to the moon in the 70s because you're so far away in the technology and the price of everything didn't allow you to return. Now it feels very different.
Yeah, crazy. And then on a on a like sort of relational friendship area, how has that gone? Because you're obviously in Perth for a long time, and then that for me is a scary part of any move because I'm very relational. Is just thinking, okay, how's it going to look making new friends, but also the friends that you have made, how's that relationship going to change?
Well, that's interesting. I was in town DBD this morning with a friend, a long-term friend in Sydney, and I said, the hard thing as you get older is, I've got to make friends again. Or do you? So I've got friends in Perth. It's very easy to move somewhere and then just settle down and hide.
Yes.
I do know people in Sydney, but the irony, I suppose, is I know them better than my wife would know them because
Right.
they come here more often. But there's a cohort here. So I've kept friends in Sydney and I've kept friends in Perth. The older you get, the less relational energy you have, but the more relational capital you put into a few friends. And I think that's important. The issue will be finding a good church to go to, and there are plenty, that local, that my son can be, can get a friendship group too. At 16, it's probably easier to move, but it's also a wrench from friends and
Yeah.
church and basketball team for him. So that's that's the issue. So the little things make it tiring when you move because there are. It's not just you have toll roads. You have parking on the street costs you everywhere.
Yes.
Parking
Yeah.
at the beach costs you. It's all the little things and add up, and then you've got to navigate relationships. But that's okay. I don't. People know about me more than they know me on this side of it. It's interesting the amount of people I
Yeah.
meet. They go, "Oh, I know who you are," and I go, "Well, I don't know who you are," and not that I don't want to know who they are, but people know about me more than they know me. I think. That's the sort of thing. It's just because of social media presence, I suppose, or books. But
That's an interesting one.
yeah, yeah, and that's always an odd one, isn't it? I have a twin brother who lives in Sydney. He's
Oh,
a fairly well-known academic, and yet people stop him in the street and say, "Are you Stephen McAlpine?" And he goes, "No."
he must
Look,
love that.
well, as twins, that wears a bit thin after 57 years. I'll tell you that.
Exactly.
We,
Yeah, yeah.
I do flex with that one,
That is brilliant. Well, I know since last time we spoke, you've released a book, Future Proof, and that was around how to live in a culture that's always changing. Do you want to give a snapshot into why you wrote that book and just sort of what it's been like since you've released that?
Yeah, it's interesting that I think it's been a sleeper book in some respects for me because it probably sold more copies than I anticipated, given it didn't win Australian Christian Book of the Year, and I haven't promoted it much, and I've been traveling. But How to Live for Jesus in a Culture That Keeps on Changing was, I guess, the follow up to Being the Bad Guys, and I wrote it because I thought the front cover, which your listeners won't see, but is the picture of a sort of this looping sort of pipeline all over the place. And I was in a restaurant with some friends in Perth before I left at the start of the year. I had to go to New Zealand for a couple of months. And the waitress said, "That looks like a cosmic roller coaster." And I said, "You're not far wrong, because we live in a culture that feels like rapid discontinuous change." And
What do
I
you
wrote
mean by
this
that?
book.
Sorry.
Well, I think there was a sense maybe 30 years ago, especially with the whole, I think it was Francis Fukuyama's book, The End of History, that the liberal progressive framework of economics and culture would win the day in the world. And it feels like it didn't. It feels like we're not in a cable car going to the top of a progressive, utopian, rationalistic mountain. We're on a roller coaster and we don't know where it's going to go next. Generalized anxiety in our culture and the specific anxiety among people. Part of the reason I wrote the book was to say, how can the church be future proof and how can it read the future well without being tied to it or afraid of it? And that's why I wrote the book. I think things had changed enough from being the bad guys that it felt like this book picked the eyes out of where we're headed a little bit.
Yeah, very good. So with that, then I'm curious to have a conversation around like the impacts of secular culture on church culture. I find it fascinating that that's what you covered of it is how the church can look to the future and plan for the future without being apathetic towards it or fearful about it. But there's this confidence in who God is. But I'm also noticing as well there's like the church seems to follow suit often of what's happening around secular culture. as opposed to the other way around. So what have you noticed in terms of how secular culture, or even like you've said in Sydney, pagan culture, um, how that impacts on the church?
Well, I guess the first thing to think is that the framework of how you view humans is important in our cultural moment. What does it mean to be a person in community? What does it mean to be an individual? So the expressive individualism thing is big in our culture at the moment, and that has implications in terms of obviously the gender and sexuality debate always comes up. But what is the future of humans? I think that's something that the church has struggled with its eschatology, that we didn't in the 70s and 80s. There was just some crazy stuff eschatologically, I think, and we shied away from talking about where are we headed. And suddenly we've been blindsided by fears about the future, and we haven't got as strong an eschatological framework. So as to where we're headed. And Trevin Wax in the Gospel Coalition said that the key issue in our cultural moment is the crisis for the church is on anthropology. What does it mean to be human? Are we created with meaning and purpose, or do we create and form that for ourselves? Well, I think that questions come up in the church, that we haven't leaned into our identity as both created beings by God and as new creation people, as well as we could have. And so we're caught in this mix of, am I supposed to form who I am? What does the church have to offer me personally? Do I have to sacrifice for this group of people? Um, it feels like the issues of uh, institution and how the culture is suspicious of institutions bleed straight into church. At the very same time that the culture is looking for something more, which is interesting to me. I think one of the reactions we had over the last 30 years as the new atheism sprang up was to create a more sensible version of Christianity that could manage it and could show that we're just as, thought out as you are. But at the moment, we're seeing a rise in a desire for something that's beyond the material. And we're seeing a reintroduction of pagan ways of thinking about spirituality in the West. And the church has to be ready to respond to that. And I don't know how well placed we are to do so at the moment.
Yeah, very good. How would you say the church can position herself to respond to those things that are rising up in our culture? I think that spirituality one is really prominent because people are more open to things, more open to experiences, to discovering, back to that individualism, discovering themselves and how they engage with the world around them. Um, and I think it's an important issue for the church to actually help people navigate, because if we don't, then it just ends up with this. I feel like this messy water that you end up just going with whatever new trend is happening, or you just end up lost in the sea, right?
Yeah, and someone's going to help them navigate it, probably poorly. So at the moment, you will see, someone was saying to me the other day, they're on a bus and they heard someone talking about the stocks and the price of shares. And the next conversation was which psychic reading they were going to have that weekend. They have this weird modernist, superstitious framework bonded together. So you're
Right.
going to see a rise in vague spirituality, but also things where the individual says, what will give me power? What will give me control in a world in which I feel increasingly powerless and I feel increasingly out of control? That's a danger, clearly, because the point of the gospel is not to give you power to control things your way, but to submit to the true spiritual truth, the gospel of Jesus, and to submit to not just an abstract idea, but to a person. Ross Douthat, writing in the New York Times, said, the return to spirituality will be dangerous for people who have no framework about what good and evil is. And I think that's probably something we need to address, how to be spiritual in a way that's a bit weird compared to maybe what we were 30 years ago, but also more compelling to people who are looking for something beyond the material world. I don't know how evangelicals
Right.
will navigate that, but I think that's something we need to navigate.
Yeah, and another sort of like similar thing that I'm noticing happening, and I've had a few conversations with people just with the whole deconstructionism. So I think there's like this rise of deconstruction happening with millennials and Gen Zs, and um, the church. Maybe it's like what you're saying before, because they didn't have a proper view of the future, so they weren't prepared. But it seems like they're silencing a lot of deconstruction happening, which is very risky because it's not recognizing that people are actually looking partly for what the truth is. Um, so what's your thoughts on like how the church can handle that, or even as Christians, how we can handle deconstruction, not be fearful of it, not be apathetic towards it, but actually see it as this is a great opportunity, because doubt can be and often is the doorway to faith.
Yeah, one of the things I'd say is there's two ways of looking at deconstruction. You can deconstruct to nothing, and that's problematic.
Mm.
But you can deconstruct to, as they say, ad fontes, back to the source. And so, say, a great book out at the moment is called Priest of History by Sarah Irving Steinbreaker. And she talks about the role of Christians to tend and garden and care for and steward history. So you will deconstruct to nothingness, ironically, going forward, if you don't have a good view of history, where history's come from and where it's headed. So lots of our deconstruction at the moment is ahistorical. And I think if you're going to deconstruct historically in a good way, you'll come back to the source, come back to the font, come back to the foundations. But if you don't have a view of history, you'll deconstruct it to nothingness. And I think the church could do well. Carl Trueman talks about this in his latest book as well. To what are the guardrails for people to say, you can have doubt and ask serious questions, because Christians through history have. Christians through history have had many questions. And so we don't have to fear your doubts. We can address them, and we don't have to shut them away, but we don't have to let you deconstruct with no safety net. So the church
Yes.
has to have a good view of history and a good view of the future, because that will help people who are in a deconstruction process to have somewhere safe to land. And unless you've got a good landing point, that's when deconstruction is ahistorical and everything just becomes a chimera, which you just fall through to an endless, bottomless pit, I think.
Right. And what does that say? What does that creating a space of safety look like practically?
Well, I think one thing you'd have to say is churches need to realize that their Christian young people are probably not as Christian as they think they are in the way they think through things. Not just young people, but there's certainly that era. And then give them permission to find out, or to go on a journey of exploration within the guardrails themselves. To not assume that Christian young people in particular have the same frameworks of thinking. To not assume that Christian young people particularly know what it's like to grow up in a Christianized culture. The assumptions we have about the life we're living, that my generation and younger generation, older generations had, was this is a Christianized world, and we kind of know the framework for how to do that. Younger generations don't, and
Mm.
technology is driving a lot of that as well. So it's, do I believe the gospel enough that I can hear people's fears and worries and
Mm.
let them sit in it without, rushing to fix it now, but at the same time saying, yeah, in these crazy turvy times, used to say what's right and wrong. How do you manage that tension? That's what leaders
Yeah.
are going to have to do in the next 30 years.
Yeah. And what's I suppose before I ask what's the biggest risk to leaders as they navigate and journey this, um taking a step back is, I think it was, I'm not too sure. You sound like you've recently read Carl Trueman's latest book, but does he talk about in that book returning? There's like a return to liturgical practices and contemplative practices, and um, there's that desire in people. Is that right?
Well, a couple of things he says. One of the observations, I interviewed him a few months ago. One of the observations was, why are some evangelicals moving to Rome and Orthodoxy? And part of
Yeah.
it's because the framework of liturgy that says there's something that exists that's older than you, that was here before you got here, and will be here when you leave. And it holds you in place. And it's kind of monolithic. Now, you can do bad versions of that. That's why we're seeing extremes and tribalism things going on. But Carl Trueman says for an evangelical from the Reformed tradition, we need to lean into uh, the confessions and the liturgies of the past because they give us meaning and purpose going forward. And in that sense, seeing evangelicals, and I've known some who've left the evangelical church and gone to Rome and the Orthodox framework, is because evangelicalism kind of deconstructed a lot of those things and said they don't matter, we don't need them, we need to be relevant, and we need to throw those things out. And lo and behold, younger people are looking for frameworks. So I think that's critical. And Carl Trueman would say, let's give them the right frameworks, let's give them the evangelical reformed confessions of the past to show them that they are still valid and worthy things to hold on to going forward. And so I don't want people to return to those things out of mere preference for worship style. I want them to return to those things because they keep us, and the things that were written in the past have relevance today. And we don't need to keep reinventing everything every generation. I think that's what I'd say.
Right. And I think that's like a real struggle because people do want and are maybe in Australia anyway, they have this tendency to be attracted towards the new. I've seen that with like our love for boutique cafes or specialty cafes, and you're sort of wanting to find what's new, find what's like trending, but then you jump to the next things. And I think that's important to be able to be grounded in the past. But you're right, we haven't been given a proper framework of how that looks like. Um, so yeah, how are leaders going to be challenged in navigating this, in discipling people in this framework that sort of is grounded in scripture, grounded in what's good and what's true, and sort of propels you into the future without fear, without apathy.
Mm. Look, I'd say there's no rocket science answer. Part of the issue is turning up week in, week out to be with the people of God and sitting under King Jesus as he speaks to us through his word. I hate to say that's the boring option, but it's kind of like it kind of is, right? Because one of the issues that I've seen more than anything is that uh, that church life together thins out first before the counter discipleship program of the world kicks in. And a good buffer to how the extremes of our cultural moment surely has to be the people of God living in a way that looks real and looks true and looks better than what the culture does, but also looks more self-sacrificial. Because I think part of our issue is we want to do light that's true and good and better than the world for me. The gospel says the opposite of that. It says it's serving other people. It's loving God and loving others in the context of the gospel. What does that look like? And I don't think you will find out whether those things work until real trouble comes along in your life. You'll lean on the things that you believe and that you live for. And so suffering is a big issue in our cultural moment. How do we deal with suffering? How do we deal with worry, anxiety, suffering, disappointment? And I think the church can give us a framework of what the Bible says about the Bible is a story of God's people dealing with suffering now, knowing that glory is coming. That's the future proof of the. And Marx would, poo-poo that and say people can be kept in suppression so that with the hope of, some vague abstract future. But the story of the Bible is that what's coming is far better, and the extrapolation of what's happening now, of what you're living now. So there's great joy in living for Jesus now, and it will be completed on the last day. There's great suffering for living for Jesus now for people in many areas of life, in many areas of the world, and there's suffering for God's people now in this part of the world. But suffer will lead to joy in the age to come. I don't think we've got a framework of thinking about how to put the Bible together like that as well as we could. My experience is that churches that have traditionally not had the same biblical theology framework as evangelicals in our Reformed tradition are starting to come to that big picture story of the Bible. What does it mean to pilgrim together? And you see
Mm,
John Mark Comer's work about the daily discipleship practices. People are
yeah,
looking for things to cling on to every day that will make sense and give meaning in a world that seems senseless and meaningless. And they
yeah,
want to do it in bite-sized ways for the modern world.
yeah. That's fascinating. Yeah, John Mark Comer's works been it's been quite significant, I'd say, particularly for millennials, just having something to put words to in terms of that desire of like there's a practical outworking of your faith. Um, I heard in an interview that he did recently, he was saying it's like a reminder that these practices are good, but again, if it's not leading you to Jesus, if you're doing it because you're just wanting to have a better life, you've missed the point. Um,
That was a great comment. I read that comment by him as well and went, that's interesting, isn't it? That we could have all these good liturgical practices that are solely based on myself, right?
Mm.
And Cara Isabella Burton, in her book Strange Rites, mentions that as well, that the modern spiritual search by younger generations, she calls them the remixed generations. You can grab this bit of spirituality from here and this opposing view from somewhere else and cobble them all
Mm.
together for the sake of a better self,
Right.
for running my own life my own way. But it still steeps you and marinades you in the expressive individualism of the age. And
Yeah.
one of the things I write in Fisher Proof is, how do you out-relate the culture? How do you do relationships differently in a culture in which the default is expressive individualism? How do you do relationships well in which the default is get rid of the negative people in your life? You know, as
Mm.
Jesus said one time. No, he didn't. But you know what I mean? And say,
Yeah.
we can cobble together a spirituality that looks particularly like me. We can cobble together self-discipline, you know, cold showers, running every day, go to the gym, eating well, purely for selfish reasons.
Yeah.
And we could do all those things on the surface and we're still living the modern, isolated, expressive individual life.
Yeah, brilliant. I think that's like hit the nail on the head because yeah, it is so true that I think there's this that expressive individualism. We do want to feel good, and it is that um that lean against suffering. So it's like we don't want to suffer, we don't want to have a hard or difficult life. So we look for what's going to give us an easy life, what's going to fulfill us. And I think partly the spiritual practices and being apprentice of Jesus and that sort of um, terminology and language has been really appealing for so many people because it does it does feed into that narrative of like, okay, this seems like it will create comfort. It seems like it will lead to the good life. And I think that's also missing the point of like, say, back to John Mark Comer is his intentions is like, let's be with Jesus. And that often means, I mean, a big part of spiritual formation is going through suffering. Like that's one of the biggest things is we have to accept that if we are going to be shaped and formed like Jesus, we're going to have to be a people who um, embrace Jesus as we walk through suffering, and
100%.
that's countercultural, right? It's not a message that's spoken.
Well, that's exactly. Look, I'll give you a Western Australian example. A few years ago, Jill and I took a more of a staycation up at Mindarie Marina, which is sort of a human-made, carved out kind of quiet bit of Mindarie. Whereas the beach itself was quite rough in Mindarie, but the Mindarie Keys Marina is beautiful. It feels like Costa del Sol. It's like, oh, it's a beautiful spot. All of the houses open inward, like the big balconies open onto the marina. And but on the Mindarie beach, there's a sign that says, "This is not a swimming beach. You'll get drowned here." You know, and the wind was howling through the front door. She kicked the front door closed. And one day, Jill and I went down to the restaurant at the in the marina, the sort of microbrewery, and I said, "Does anyone actually think about Jesus at all in a place like this? Because it just feels like it's laid on tap, right? The good life."
Like, right.
And then I thought later, but you know what? the Australian Western dream is a life of comfort and ease. How can I craft that? My own self-actualized self. But every now and then, no matter what marina that you carve out for yourself, the wind or the waves of reality will wash over it one day. Suffering, disappointment, despair,
Mm,
death, fear, anxiety, loss, unforgiveness. And you will have to, can it sustain it? Can
mm,
that light you crafted sustain those waves and that wind? The answer is
mm,
no. It's the gospel that says suffering is not something that's we have no category for. There's suffering comes about because of the brokenness of our world, but in the midst of suffering, God can do something in us, and will do something in us if we allow Him. That will make us more like Jesus,
mm.
and that's a category error for our culture. That they don't have a category for that,
Right.
and live long, and that's why people flocked to Jordan Peterson, because his main theme was, "Let me tell you about suffering," and
Mm,
because everyone was going through it, because not everyone
crazy.
was living the iPhone ad.
Yeah.
Life is hard. And so that's a compelling reason to say that these modern spiritual practices, even if they're Christian, are not ends in themselves.
Yeah.
They are there to shape you to be more like Jesus, and they are there to hold you when suffering inevitably hits you. They are there to make sure that you do not deconstruct your faith away in disgust or anger at God, or are lured away by something other than Jesus.
Mm.
That's what those things are for. They are not there as an end in themselves.
Great. Um, just talking about the tension between how leaders are really called to disciple people and put them help with this framework of how we can navigate um, yeah, just the tides of individualism and this new searches for transcendence and spirituality. And yet, at the same time, what we're seeing as well is there's a deep distrust in our culture for leaders and almost a deconstruction of uh, leadership in the church and what that looks like. So I think young people, especially, I'm not too sure about older people, but young people especially come into the church with a lens of I can't trust what is being said. So how do you sort of navigate that area?
That's a really interesting question, and it's exactly what I think is happening at the moment. So you've got a couple of things. The anti-institutionalism has bled into the church, and then people read things about the way leaders have behaved, and they have access to more information about how leaders have behaved because of technology. And technology
Right.
is not something we've talked about a lot in this, but technology has pushed that. It also means that, and I experienced it with an older generation when I was helping out at a church, and someone said to me, "I like your sermons, but I get all of my sermons online from, fill in the blank." So
Yeah.
they're looking to authority elsewhere that's disembodied from your leadership. And the other thing too is we also have the language of autonomy and self determination, and the
Mm.
language of therapeutic culture that says, if you try to discipline me in an area of life, that is abusing me.
Yeah.
Now, there is abuse that happens, but what does church discipline look like in the modern world in which everyone can get up and leave your church and go to another church tomorrow after you've disciplined them about something, and that other church won't ask you what the issue was? It'll just,
Mm.
hey, we've got a new member. So there's a breakdown in how that works. When the scriptures say, obey your leaders and submit to those in authority over you, that feels like abuse. So what leaders need to do is not tighten up, but lead by example, as Peter says to the elders, as a fellow elder and a witness of the sufferings of Christ, that you're supposed to lead those uh, sheep, the under shepherds that will lead the sheep, as both a sheep themselves to King Jesus, but as a shepherd who known that one day the chief shepherd will one day appear, as it says in
Mm.
1 Peter 5. So leading is going to be complex in a time of rapid discontinuous change, and it will always feel that you have to lead not from a sense you'll have to lead from a sense of having the authority of a light that looks right and true and good and is right and true and good, and in a way that doesn't crush other people. And those are going to be complex things to do. You've got to
Mm.
have to lead by godly example, which is great because we didn't want leaders who didn't lead by godly example, but just pulled the leadership lever. That's
Right.
changing. So people have less respect for leaders coming in, and it feels like you got to earn it. Uh, and people will say, I get my leadership from outside of this group of people, and that's going to
Mm.
be complex as well. So I think there's a couple of, battles among leadership. The solution is not to become a cult leader yourself. And you're seeing that people want heavy leadership because it's leading us in a direction in the time of change.
Right. That's a scary thought because it sort of plays into that narrative of, or the story of, the log in your eye. So you can't see something that's affecting you, or that you're entering into a blind spot. Sorry. Um, so how do how do you navigate the blind spots, and prevent yourself from leading someone into a cult, or into strong leadership, or into a sort of loose led leadership where you just find your own truth?
Yeah, a couple of things that equal and opposite problems, right? So the heavy shepherding thing is mitigated by, I'd say, don't let those people into leadership. We've got to do a better job of that. And also, if you were to go to a church and you see a good, strong framework of leadership where people can disagree with each other, but still say they're on the same common vision, where you go in and it isn't one leader who's 50 and everyone else is sort of 22, that would be a safe place to be. Better anyway, at least not fully safe.
Mm.
And the flip side, I guess, is then we're called to lead, and
Yeah.
leading is somewhere that the best leaders are not people who serve themselves. So I think the barometer of leadership means that in the culture at the moment, there's no hall pass, no free pass for leaders today. They're going to be subjected to more scrutiny. But at the other side of it, people say, well, I don't need to be led. God's telling me this myself. And you go, no, the scriptures will give us the framework,
Mm.
and we will explore the scriptures together because the chief shepherd oversees the under shepherds, and we will bring this to scripture. Once a person can see a leader loves them, is for them, but wants to shape them to be more like Jesus and gives them a little bit of leeway to get things wrong from time to time, I think that you're onto the right kind of combination for a leader.
Very good. So tell me, I know we mentioned, or you're speaking about it early on in the conversation, but this idea of transcendence, and I know you had some thoughts around the new searches for transcendence, um, and we spoke briefly about that. But yeah, share a bit about your thoughts. What have you been thinking on that idea in our cultural moment?
Well, it's still kind of unformed thought, but two things. Look, on the weekend, I was speaking at a church in rural Australia where it was a major hospital and there were young Christian workers at the church, and they came up to me afterwards, and it kind of feels good that they said it. Everything you said about what our friends might be into is true. They're all into tarot and the stars and the spiritual search. And the start of Sarah Irving Steinbreaker's book, Press of History, she talks about how she'd arrived in Oxford. So she should be at the pinnacle of her life. She should be ticking all the boxes. But something was missing, the big meaning, purpose, and transcendence. She wanted something more that gave meaning and purpose to what she was doing. And then Rod Dreher's new book, his previous two books were very much about the culture wars, I think. But his third book is that wonder and meaning and searching for it in a secular age it's almost scarily transcendent in its understanding. So what I think people are looking for is something more. And that's not just the vestige of the 20th century. It's really interesting that in the times of of the 20th century, just in the early parts of it, between the wars and just before the wars, there was a surge in interest in spiritualism in a pagan way, because people were looking for something more in a time of crisis. So we've been told all these years that you do you, etc., etc., and meaning and purpose is something that you create for yourself. And lo and behold, it's not enough. So
Right.
people are looking for a spiritual search. It doesn't necessarily mean they're looking for Jesus at this point, because the Jesus program for many people is still about, I can't live how I want. I can't
Yeah.
the same that I can't have the romantic partner that I want. I can't do what I like.
Mm.
But they are searching, and they will keep searching, because in the end, none of those things will fully satisfy. And they're not personal in the way that the gospel of Jesus is.
Hmm. So yeah, what does that mean for us? What does that mean to begin to wrestle with it?
Yeah. I think one of the things it's going to say to evangelicals is, you got to be a little bit weirder. You got to believe that there's a heaven above and a hell below and an earth in the middle and things move between them. And don't try to downplay the invisible side of spirituality, that there's an invisible realm that actually has meaning and significance and interacts with us. Now, we don't have to get all spooky and poltergeist about us, but we have played the modern game. Can I show you can I show the rational scientific world how rational and scientific I am as a Christian? That
Right.
you can plug and play Christianity and it still fits the modern world. And lo and
Mm.
behold, next minute, everyone's out doing Caro and Dyke
Yeah.
and Palmer eating. You go, I didn't see that coming. And uh, perhaps we should have, because
Well,
that's
yeah.
the logical next extension.
Yeah, I was gonna say, because that whole rationalization of everything sort of, I mean, it's been around for ages, but really you notice it from the age of enlightenment start creeping in, is that division between the mind and the body or the soul, and sort of separating the two into two different categories. And then of course what we're seeing now is that I suppose there's an outcry of what does our humanity look like? We are like whole beings, so we're not just rationalized thinking beings, but we're actually in a body. We actually can experience things, and that's sort of what you're saying. There is a spiritual world, and we feel things and we sense things, and sometimes we don't exactly understand what's happening, but there's this other part of ourselves that's saying there's something else out there. Um, so I love what you're saying. We need to be more weird.
Yeah, well, look, you think about. I think it wasn't Sir Arthur Conan Doyle who was, who wrote Sherlock Holmes, the most rational, cool, detached, scientifically minded detective you're ever going to find, and the answer is clearly obvious and it's rational, and we're just missing it. But Sir Arthur Conan Doyle was into spiritualism and Ouija boards and all the, you know,
Right.
at the same time. So you have the pensions going on, and when I say weirder, um, here the analogy I would use is, uh, we we've allowed the thinness between the unseen realm and the seen realm to thicken up, to cross over as Christians. So
Okay.
at the very time that people are looking for transcendence, even my evangelical tradition was saying most of church is just about the horizontal relationships between the people in the church. You feel like the people are aching for something vertical, transcendent,
Yeah.
and we don't want to go down the hyper Pentecostal line or whatever it is, and go. But it is true somewhat that the it's just the sliding door moment between the invisible world and the visible world, and we have to believe that's true. So, for example, when I was young, you know, sort of slightly fundamentalist phase of Northern Irish living, I can remember singing, "Somewhere in outer space, God has prepared a place for those who love Him and obey," as if heaven was there somewhere.
Right.
That's not the spiritual world works.
Mm.
It's not a somewhere in outer space.
Yeah.
It's one day it will be revealed, because it's as imminently close to us as possible. I think if Christians, evangelicals, were leaned into that a little more, that wouldn't hurt them. It's not as if they've leaned anywhere near it for some time. And I'm not saying jump the intellectual, rational framework. I think Christianity is intellectually satisfying and it's the
Yeah.
truth. But somewhere along the line, we're having to say to people who are looking for something more, we believe we have the truth about what that something more is, that invisible realm, and let me introduce you to the God who inhabits that invisible realm and how it operates. And we haven't done that very well.
Yeah, I love that. And yeah, you're right. It's not about throwing out one and sort of focusing on the other, because that's sort of what we're experiencing now. Is we think that the way to get people is through or purely through reason and logic, um, but we're not focusing on the other side. Um, how can we begin to introduce these sort of thoughts and ideas into our everyday living?
That's a good question. Uh, from the leadership down, and this is my experience, I'm just solely from my own experience, the leadership was pastoring in a church, preach as if it matters, as if it's real. And then don't be pragmatic about how you resolve everything in your church life. So if there is an issue of unforgiveness in your church, and we deal with unforgiveness issues in our lives all the time, what does it look like in the spiritual realm to be unforgiving? You could solve the unforgiveness between Mrs. Jones and Mrs. Smith in your church by plonking Mrs. Jones as far away in the church as she can possibly from Mrs. Smith, right? And if you've got a criticised auditorium, they may never meet. But do you think that's solving the unforgiveness problem in your church? Because if you were to peel back the sky and see what's happening in the invisible realm in your church, if unforgiveness is there, it would look a bit dark and ugly and fly-blown, wouldn't it? So you want to say unforgiveness has a spiritual, invisible aspect to it that we haven't grasped. And we need to solve the unforgiveness issue for two reasons. To give one another as God in Christ has forgiven you. Forgive one another. And also because there's a spiritual reality to unforgiveness that we can't see, but which is just as real as Mrs. Jones walks past Mrs. Smith and snubs her. There's something spiritual going on there. And we don't even talk about that language. And so we don't, in a world in which everyone wants to manifest, the universe to manifest to them, and start talking about what that actually looked like. And I saw someone who tragically lost some relatives of theirs who previously, years ago, this person had been a Christian, and she literally put on social media, lean into me, look to me, etc., giving her name. I will help you. The universe. The universe doesn't care. The universe is cold, vast, and indifferent to that. But there is a God above who cares about those things, and you don't need to manifest the universe to get those things. The invisible God has a visible expression of love and concern for you in this world. And I think it would be those things. Now, our Pentecostal brothers and sisters already get that. And which is why I think we need to learn a little bit from them. And I'll say that. Because my experience is many of my Pentecostal brothers and sisters and I get invited to speak at charismatic and Pentecostal churches, they want to know, how do we navigate this intellectually as well? Because we've got all the other stuff. We've just got to try to, they're starting to read Charles Taylor and all of the Tim Keller stuff on this and all those books and saying, help us navigate the modern world. And I said, okay, here's a Barker exchange. Help me navigate the spiritual world.
Yeah.
Maybe we need to actually come together on those two things at times.
Exactly. I mean, that's just a beautiful example of why the church should strive towards unity and learn from one another, because we have our strengths and we have our weaknesses, and it doesn't have to reflect poorly. But I think when we isolate ourselves, just like on an individual level, how much harm that can do.
Well, I think, that's exactly. If you go to sub-Saharan Africa as a missionary from the West, you soon get disavowed of the notion that there isn't an invisible realm. And suddenly your evangelical framework had to be able to hold those things.
Right.
And that's what I'm saying. It's like you'll find out that those issues won't stay in sub-Saharan Africa.
Yeah.
They'll come here.
I love what you're saying, and at the same time, I think how difficult is it for churches to strive towards those things when they are preoccupied with their ministries, um,
Mhm.
trying to get people in, trying to focus on a brand per se in terms of this is why we want to get people here, when what you're talking about is it's very granular, it's very relational, it takes up time and effort, and often it doesn't happen instantaneously. It's sort of like that commitment, that journey. Forgiveness is a great example, because when you're dealing with unforgiveness, sometimes it can take a day, it can take a year, it can take 5 years, depending whatever that is. So how do you wrestle with that?
Well, you say we're about branding and getting people in, and maybe that's the cultural bit that we need to change a little bit,
Mm.
because everyone else in the secular world was about branding and getting people in. And lo and behold, here we are, a day late and a dollar short, branding and getting people in. So, what if we said, actually, to join this group of people, I won't lower the bar at one level. I'm going to say, here's the bar, it's pretty high. Come one, come all. But Jesus is going to change us. And the rules of engagement in the church, it's a different operating system. We don't do relationships the way the world does. We don't do expressive individualism the way the world does. Now, the word of caution is that it's interesting that university campuses are experiencing a return of cult coming onto campus,
Yeah.
getting a lot of people. And the reason is people are looking for someone and something to love on them and to give them meaning and purpose beyond themselves. And if the
Right.
church isn't able to do that in a maneuverable way, cults will do it.
That is crazy. Yeah, that is so true. It goes back to uh I can't remember if we mentioned it, but just that basic principle is like we're going to be shaped and formed by something. So we're looking for some sort of framework. So if the church doesn't provide that gospel centered framework, that framework that
Well, someone
points
will.
us towards,
Yeah.
yeah, someone will, and we're going to find it. So it's a good wake up call, I'd say, to actually start being intentional about the way we approach these things.
Oh, it is. It 100% is. And perhaps I think in the next 30 years, maybe a book or two down the line. I'm writing another book at the moment.
Oh,
Uh,
brilliant.
you know, but the future pre-con, it's in 30 years' time, if you come back in a DeLorean sports car from Back to the Future, what is the church going to look like? It's going to look very
Mm.
different, I think. We won't have the money or the position or the influence we've had necessarily. That, God may bring revival, but if God does bring revival, it might be a little different. You won't, I think we're going to have a much more stripped back version of church with less programs.
Yeah.
I think people will want to buy in. If people are going to buy into something, they're going to buy into, I think, expression of church every week, but I think that's what that, to do it well, do it once on Sunday, and something during the week where they can value add by getting together with God's people and just decompressing over Bible and prayer and a meal and making sense of the craziness.
Mm.
And it won't necessarily be a 10 point, 16 questions Bible study based on the previous week's sermon.
Yeah. Do
I
you,
don't think that's going to be the future.
do you think in saying that, do you think that's a healthy shift?
Yes. That's what I'm saying. I'm saying church needs all white space. Because if I were to say to a non Christian, you should come to church with me, and they go, I'm really busy, and you want me to add busyness. No, I want you to do less of those things you're doing out there and do more of these things in here. And then I
Mm.
want you to go out to the thinner non Christian relationships you have and find more people to bring in. Yeah. Hang on. There's something wrong with that framework. Now,
Yeah.
people will go, well, that means you're just letting people do what they want and uh, you know, five activities for the kids and three music things. And no, I'm saying life is so busy and so frantic that the Christian speed of life will have to look different to the non-Christian speed of life. It will have to be that we go, no, I won't have everything plus Jesus. There's some stuff that I'm just going to say, we're not going there. We're not going to get ourselves that wrapped up in those things. We will dial down whether our kids need those experiences of life at the same level that the non-Christian families do. We're going to model to our kids that the good life doesn't look like all that the good life looks like Jesus and his people together.
Yeah,
I think
brilliant.
that's going to be important.
Yeah, that's great. And I think that'll also help people in that search for meaning and purpose and belonging, because it's not disconjointed. It's not something that you look to the church to find. You need to now fill up your schedule with all these different programs and meetings. Not to I don't want to paint it in a negative light, because sometimes it's really helpful, but in terms of, you're not just doing things for the sake of doing things to try and be busy, but it's being intentional about, okay, well, what is going to bring us, shift our attention to God. I think there's been like a rise in people wanting to practice Sabbath for that reason. Is how can we focus on God uh, by doing something so counter to the culture? Let's just have a day dedicated to not filling our schedules, having that white space, like you said, where we can seek God and allow Him to fill that time with whatever He desires.
Yeah, that's great. Because two things on that with the Sabbath, right? When Israel was told you'll keep the Sabbath and you'll close the gates of Jerusalem on the Sabbath, what they were saying is in 6 days, God is going to ensure that we are sustained in a culture in which they need 7 days. And we're trusting God for that seventh day. Because it's a window to all of trust in all of life. But you would economically hamstring yourself by closing the gates of Jerusalem for the Sabbath day while everyone else was doing trade.
Right.
And that's critical to thinking, where is my actual support and where is my actual security? And the second thing is, I remember the Sabbath in the sense of when the shops were shut on Saturday at lunchtime in Perth back in the day, and Sunday was pretty closed. And if I were to say, some friends of mine 2 years ago said, what would be the one thing you'd say to parents if they wanted to disciple their children well over the next 30 years? And one of them said, I wish I could go back 20 years and tell them, don't let your kids do sport on Sunday. Now, I know that's retrograde, but it's like, what was he saying by that? Just don't let them do sport? No. Keep the community of God's people front and foremost in the sense of we're getting together to do something that has no economic viability at one level, and that will sustain us.
Yeah.
And we're going to spend this time together doing life on life together for a longer period of time in the day in a way that will sustain us relationally going forward.
Yeah, brilliant. It's one of those things, going back to that logic and reasoning and feeling and sensing, and it makes no logical sense to like hamstring yourself in that way, but like the gifts of God are so good, and they lead us to Himself, and that's a fourth, beautiful thing to accept and receive and practice, I think.
That's right. It's counterintuitive. It makes no logical sense that one day Jesus will peel the sky back and reappear and rule the whole cosmos publicly, right?
Right.
It's true. That's why I say about the weirdness. The weirdest thing you believe at work tomorrow morning at Ernst & Young isn't that God created male and female with a purpose and meaning that He put into them. It's that one day Jesus will come back. Now, you may pay more of a penalty for believing the first, but it's no weirder than the second.
Very good.
But
Yeah.
it's true.
Yeah, so good. Well, I don't want to hold you any longer, Steve. So thank you so much for the conversation, for your time. And yeah, but before we go, if people are wanting to find out more about yourself or your work, or grab a copy of Future Proof, where would you point them to?
Well, it's finally at stephenmcalpine.com, the humbly named. So stephenmcalpine.com. It's got my blog. It's got request forms, bookings, whatever into other information, podcast stuff there. If you're looking to buy a copy of Future Proofs, it comes through the Good Book Company. in Australia, UK, US, and also The Wandering Bookseller in Sydney has a bunch of copies of those, or Koorong. So you can find them there as well. And if you want to drop me a line, there's something on my website. You can just drop me a line and say, I like that, or what about this, or I thought you were wrong. And I'm more than happy to reply to you.
Awesome. Well, yeah, thanks again for the conversation, and hope you enjoy the rest of your week ahead.
Thanks, Caleb. It's good to speak to you again.